talked about the need for people to basically become their own editors now. The material that you have access to, at least, is not necessarily filtered or packaged or checked by an editor. So I thought it would be interesting to learn what an editor does, because people maybe don't have a good understanding of that. And then kind of hopefully just hearing this will give you some insights into where kind of things can go wrong, and it's easy to get misinformation. And I will just back up real quick. J-School is the shorthand that the journalists call for the school where you go and you major in journalism. And I do not have that. So, but I kind of learned it on the road. I learned it on the job. And so I actually have kind of an interesting inside out view of it, or outside in view, however you put it. And to me, it's kind of fascinating, some of the things that I didn't know I didn't know. So anyway, an editor decides at a newspaper, and it would be kind of the same at a television station, although some of these things involve print, obviously, but an editor decides what's newsworthy, checks facts for accuracy, and I'll talk a little bit about that in some detail later. In a newspaper, an editor might be involved in what's called developmental editing, which is kind of guiding the structure and focus of a story. Usually an editor will tell a reporter either go cover this event, or they'll say, let's do a story about such and such. And they perhaps have what's called more of a, I think the word is an enterprise story where there's sort of an idea, and then you have to kind of go and see if it's true and research it. And an example of an enterprise story might be something like, I wrote a story for the religion section, for example, about people who were not Christians using the rosary. So, is that happening? Who's doing it? Why are they doing it? That kind of thing. That's not an event you go cover, or just a book you go get all the answers in. You have to kind of do the work and find the information. And then what's called copy editing. And that has to do with grammar, spelling, punctuation, and what's called style. Style is basically things that newspapers do to be consistent. So if you're talking about a person who is Black, for example, or African American, do you call them Black, or do you call them African American? Or, 30 years ago, there were a few other options like Negro, for example. And then if you do say Black, or you do say Negro, is that capitalized? And why? And so I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Okay. So this decision about what is newsworthy. When I was a news producer, this was in the early to mid 80s, I worked at a TV station. It was the CBS affiliate at the time in Cleveland. If you ever watched the very first episode of Mary Tyler Moore, I think I mentioned this before, that was my story. I was an associate producer, just like her, when I started. And when I was doing, let's say, for example, the noon news, I'd come in at 6 o'clock in the morning. And one of the first things I would do is go into the wire room, where we'd have 3 or 4 machines like this one you see on the screen, all very noisy. They were teletypes, essentially, and they were constantly feeding news stories. I mean, constantly, it might have just been, stock numbers, or sports scores, or, just things that were happening around the country. And sometimes it was previews like, city council in Cleveland is going to meet today at 7 o'clock. And don't forget, this is when they're going to take the vote on XYZ. So it was just, it was a constant source of information. And part of my job was to go in and we call it rip. You'd rip these pieces of paper off, you'd sit down and take them, you'd read them, and you'd pull out what you thought might be of interest or relative to your news show. Sometimes you would have a story where essentially the anchor person would read just 20 seconds on the screen with no pictures. You tried to avoid that because television is pictures. But sometimes you would tell a story that way. Sometimes you'd go get a piece of file footage and just slap some file footage up on the screen while the reporter reads the story that somehow relates to it. And then sometimes you might say, this is a story where we need to do some looking into to see if it, if it's a real story in Cleveland, for example. So anyway, so that was my first job. So I kind of make the analogy that if you're just someone who jumps on the internet today, you're kind of like me in the newsroom. You've got to pick and choose. So what's the debate about what's newsworthy? It might be that it's of local interest. It might be of human interest. It might be news you can use. And the example I gave before was the weather. And we have weather every day. It's rarely anything of exciting, but you do want to know whether it's going to be hot or cold or rainy or not. So you can plan on whether to have your picnic or whether to take your umbrella. And then other things might be sort of politically or economically significant. So those are some of the ways that you decide whether something is newsworthy. So one of the questions that people often ask me, and I think I covered this last week, and I think I'm picking up now where I was. Is that jive with what you remember? Anybody? Okay,
yeah, go ahead.
I didn't cover this. Okay. So a lot of times people ask me this question: how do you get the stories? Get your story ideas. How do you, get the stories that you're going to write? So there's basically 3 ways I get a story. Well, there's basically 2 ways I get a story, I should say. Either an editor gives me an assignment and says, I'm a freelancer, so I can always say no, but they say, would you like to write a story about for example, I've got 2 assigned stories in the senior living section next Tuesday. One was about how what you need to do to get your checkups and your immunizations and your tests up to date, sort of in light of the fact that a lot of people got behind over the pandemic. So it was just a little kind of checklist and some interviews with doctors about what people tend to overlook and that type of thing. So that was an assignment that the editor gave me. The other way I get stories is I pitch an idea and the editor either says yes or no, or sometimes they'll say yes, but you need to be sure you cover this, or yes, but it can't be too promotional, or whatever concerns they have. So I'd say I pitch about half my stories and I get assigned about half my stories. The key point here, and a lot of times people don't believe me when I say this, if it's not what the editor or the paper considers a good story, I can't get it in the paper. So, people have wanted me to cover their bake sale and, the kids worked really hard and it's really important that they have the bake sale to, fund the trip that they're taking. And all that is absolutely true, but it's just really not a good news story. So, that is sort of an example. I'll give you one example here that kind of gives you a little bit of where the wiggle room is. My daughter was in the Nutcracker. She performed in the Nutcracker that was put on by Dallas Ballet Company. And I talked to an editor about doing something about the Nutcracker, and he said, remember, there are 35 different Nutcrackers performed in the Dallas area at Christmas time. So my daughter's ballet school doing the Nutcracker was not a story. However, I did also go back to this editor, and this was for a local section. There was a little more wiggle room to get away with this kind of thing. But I did go back and said, well, how about a story about what it takes to put on a Nutcracker? And I came up with a list of kind of like not by the numbers. And it was kind of partly facetious, but, like 65 pairs of point shoes and 20 cans of hairspray and 10 moms wrangling the costumes. And I just kind of came up with this sidebar, this side story with a list of the numbers that kind of showed you the extent of putting on a production like that. And so that did get printed. That was not a story I was paid to do, by the way. That was me putting on my PR hat for the ballet school. Okay, so the next thing an editor does is checks facts for accuracy. And this is a really kind of complicated issue, and it's not always as easy as it looks. I found an article, which is in the list of links I'm going to send you, that says that when it comes to real world complexities, the trouble is that journalists who are people often see different things when looking at the same event. a phenomenon that has been repeatedly documented by psychologists. So, for example, laboratory studies reveal that when shown a video of a group of protesters, people see either a peaceful protest or an unruly mob blocking pedestrian access, depending on their socio-political beliefs. And another example of that too is you could see some footage that looks really, like things got out of control, but in the context of maybe 10,000 people marching peacefully, it's really not representative of the event. It happened, this person punching a police officer or, breaking some glass, that happened, but that might be one of 10,000 people, or it might, and so it may not reflect the event. It might be, it was, example of what happened. So it's just that if fact checking is not as easy as it looks. And I love this quote from John Adams: "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." I absolutely believe that. I wish more people understood this. I wish people understood facts a little bit more deeply, but it is a little more complicated than it looks. There's even a play about this, and I would recommend it if you get the chance to see this. It's called The Lifespan of a Fact. And I saw this on Broadway, and it was pretty good. So I'm going to tell you a story about kind of how facts can kind of take a life of their own and how complicated they can be. I did a series of neighborhood profiles in the 2009, 2010 time period, 2007, somewhere around there. And I did like dozens of these, and they didn't pay very much. I think I got $200 for each one. They were maybe about 800 words, but they were kind of fun, and I learned a lot, and I enjoyed doing them. And I would get the assignments well in advance, so I was never on a deadline that was difficult to deal with. So anyway, I get the assignment to write about Preston Hollow. And you can see here, it had a little bit of a news hook because George Bush was moving there around that time. But one of the things that came up with each of these stories is, where are the boundaries of this neighborhood? Now, if you're writing about Plano, because I did write about suburbs as well, if you're writing about Plano, then everybody knows where the boundaries are. Although Plano ISD boundaries are not quite the same as Plano, the city of Plano boundaries, but that's another story. But those boundaries are, they're set in stone. There's a document somewhere that tells you which zip codes and which neighborhoods are in Plano and which are not. And there's not really any, debate over that. But when you get to something like Preston Hollow, where does it end and where does it begin? Actually turns out to be a little bit of a more difficult question than you might think. And when I did these profiles, I would end up going back and forth with my editor, and I got kind of frustrated because she would say, "I want the true answer, the real answer, the official answer." And I would tell her there really isn't one, because these neighborhood names are kind of almost like an oral tradition. People started calling this part of Dallas that's sort of north of Northwest Highway and sort of near the tollway, they called that Preston Hollow. But where Preston Hollow begins and ends is not a matter of any type of a political jurisdiction. And so we went back and forth, and I talked to some people, and what I finally ended up saying was that and this was kind of like, my best, I don't want to say my best guess, but this was the best I could figure out. There was one set of widely accepted boundaries, and then that was basically the one that kind of the neighbors would mostly agree on. And then there was another set of boundaries that the real estate agents like to use, because obviously Preston Hollow is a selling point, so they would be inclined to expand those boundaries. So anyway, I write this article a couple years later. For some reason, I'm doing like a Google search of my name or something. For some reason, I come across this Wikipedia entry on Preston Hollow, which says Mary Jacobs of the Dallas Morning News notes that the area, here's the boundaries essentially. And so I had to laugh because, well, that was sort of the best I could get, but now it's kind of fact. and as you can see, if you're wondering what the question is, the boundaries of Preston Hollow are going to be, this is the tollway here, This is, I think, Royal Lane. This is, I believe, Hillcrest. This is Northwest Highway. It goes over here to Midway here, but in this area, what might also be called Mayflower Estates, some people think that's part of Preston Hollow and some don't. So that's the sort of disputed area. So anyway, I just thought that was funny because, you know, I kind of felt like, what do I know? Here's what I found out, but I don't. And now it's sort of being repeated as facts. And sometimes things like that happen. I remember a long time ago, maybe about 20 years ago, there was a study that a group called Catalyst somewhere on the East Coast did about why women leave the workforce, or they leave corporate jobs. And the conclusion of their study was essentially that women were not leaving because they had babies, which was kind of the, prevailing wisdom at the time. So I called this consulting company and I asked some very specific questions about how many people were in the study, how many people ended up at the end of the study, because it went over a period of years. And I found out that there were maybe 6 women in this study, and they were making these kind of sweeping conclusions based on, and the reason wasn't that they didn't try to make it a bigger study. It was just a lot of people didn't really, end up in the final sample because not all the women had babies and, et cetera, et cetera. And meanwhile, so I find that this study is really not based on a very reasonably good sized sample. And meanwhile, literally a week later, I hear someone say in a congressional hearing that women don't leave corporate jobs because they have babies. I mean, it was repeated as fact, and nobody bothered apparently to question the study itself. So, and as to why women leave jobs, good Lord, I don't think you could, it'd be really hard to make any kind of, sweeping conclusion about that. Okay, so developmental editing, that's the next thing an editor might do. And I'm not going to get into much detail on this, but it's, here's an interesting quote: an idea is not a story, an assignment is not a story, a topic is not a story. It may take a while, but the hard work of the writing process eventually transforms something vague into something focused. Once that focus is discovered in an exploratory draft, a lead, a nut graph, a theme, a kicker, it can be rendered in the authentic voice of the writer. And that means kind of, making a really good story, really making it your own story that you've told in a really unique way. I'll give you an example. I worked on a podcast for a few years for Plano, and my partner was pretty good at she was really good at the sort of technical side of it, but didn't really have any journalism experience. And she wanted to do a podcast on the arts in Plano. And I said, that isn't a podcast. That's not a story. That's maybe a topic for a PhD thesis or a report, but it's not a story. So anyway, copy editing.
Mary?
Yes.
Can I ask you to explain to us what a nut graph is?
Oh, sure. Okay. So a nut graph, this is actually a really helpful little thing for me to use sometimes. My reporter, I may have a conversation with a reporter and say, hey, I'd like her to write a story about this new clinic over at UT Southwestern that helps older people when they break bones, because they have a lot of issues, and people who fall when they're older, often that's sort of the beginning of the end. So she said, okay, yeah, I'll take that story. Send me a nut graph. So a nut graph is basically 3 or 4 sentences sort of describing what the story is, what angle I'll be taking, and maybe who I'll be talking to. So with this one, I would have said UT Southwestern has added this new clinic called the Restore Clinic, which is a very focused and dedicated team of people who work on treating older people who've had a fall. They're called fragility falls, because if you were a younger person, you had that same fall, you would not break a bone. And so I'll talk about the clinic. And in order to not just make this a promotional piece on this particular clinic, I'll include a set of tips on the side on how you can make sure if you fall and you're injured and you're an older person, that you get good treatment and you have the best possible outcome. So that's a nut graph. I mean, I said that in probably 500 words. I'd get it down to 100 or 200, but it's basically a way for me and the editor to both be on the same page as to what I'm going to write about and what angle I'm going to take. And it kind of helps avoid surprises, especially when the editor is dealing with maybe 10 other stories that could be somewhat overlapping, and helps her keep track. So that's a nut graph. Copy editing is proofreading, obviously finding mistakes, grammar, punctuation, spelling, and then correcting for style. And you can see this is sort of an old school print version of copy editing, where there's this, they've taken the red pen and there's a series of copy editing marks that you learn in journalism school, and you make those. And I actually still do this. I write and rewrite and rewrite. And then when I'm very close to the submitting a story, I usually print it out and take a red pen to it. And that is often a way I find mistakes that I don't see otherwise for whatever reason. So let's talk a little bit about style, because I think this is interesting. I could talk about this all day, and that probably would bore you to tears. But here's a question, if you want to try and answer in the chat. What's the plural of emoji? Is it emojis or emoji? So the verdict is still a little bit out on this. But it seems that people are using emoji instead of emojis when they're talking about more than one. Now, why is that? The reason is because emoji is, I see somebody guessed. Nope. Okay, never mind. Okay, so emoji, I'll go back here. Sorry. I need to get rid of this. Okay. Emoji is a Japanese word. It's a new word that is a combination of two words, which means like story with pictures or something like that. I don't have that handy, but in Japanese, for the most part, they do not plural word by adding, obviously not an S, but anything at the end of the word. They have other ways of expressing plural. In English, we usually add an S. Sometimes we change the word. So if you have a goose, it's one goose, it's goose. If you have a bunch, it's geese. But they generally don't change the word itself. They have some other way of expressing that it is a plural. And emoji is a compound. E roughly means picture. Emoji means written character. So they put them together and made emoji. Okay, so this may just seem like, kind of nitpicky. And it is a little bit. Part of the reason why newspapers do this is it really looks unprofessional and a little sloppy if you have a lot of inconsistencies in the way you express words. I think this kind of thing may seem nitpicky to people, but I think particularly now where just about anybody can get, a website or slap up a blog or, express their, deeply thought out opinion on social media, having good grammar, good consistent style is one way to set yourself apart, news media to set themselves apart from, the next Joe. But there's also a lot of sort of journalism that goes into this. Just as an example, I think I'll go past that one, but let me go to this next screen. Here's where this kind of question actually becomes more than just style. So this came out about a year ago. The Associated Press is the sort of the style setter for most newspapers. You get a book called the AP style book, and you look in that and you say, how do I spell this? Or how do I refer to this? Or do I hyphenate that? And I refer to it often. There's also a website. So a year ago, kind of in light of the news about George Floyd, the AP changed its style to capitalize the B in black. It had been lowercase in the past. And there was a lot of thought that went into it. And I think what might surprise people is that the reason they chose this was because other identifiers like Latino, Asian American, Native American are capitalized. So they wanted it to be in line with that. But it also said that the decision followed more than 2 years of research and debate among AP journalists and outside groups and thinkers. So this may seem nitpicky to most people, but when the way you read a word like this has a subtle meaning, and you read it a lot, and these are the people who basically put the thought into like how these things should be expressed in a way that reflects fairness and accuracy, clarity, that kind of thing. So style is something that the journalists think about a lot. Hopefully it should be invisible to most readers, but it should. Well, let me go into some more things that come up here, and I'll give you some examples. So anyway, so that's my section I'm finishing up from last week about how to be your own editor. So today I'm going to talk about what I'm calling my one-day J school. J school, again, is short for journalism school. Not everybody that works in newspapers went to journalism school. I'm certainly a testament to that, but many do. Many of the people I worked with had gone to good journalism schools. So what do you learn in a journalism school? And when you get a journalism program, you will learn about the history of journalism. You will learn how to research. Nowadays, they have sort of specialty master's degrees on how to collect, assemble, and interpret data. That's a whole, body of knowledge in and of itself. Understanding studies, understanding statistics. I took a course probably about 8 years ago on how to write medical news, medical health and fitness and medical. I'd been doing it for several years by the time I took this course. And I was embarrassed to learn that I really didn't know anything about how studies, like how to interpret studies, because for one thing, there are a lot of different types of studies that you can look at if you're trying to investigate a medical question or a medical topic. There's longitudinal studies, there's double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical studies, there are literature reviews, there are studies that are sort of, for lack of a better word, that there are studies that are sort of just like the first pass. They're the studies where they're basically presented as, well, this topic is worth further investigation. So I'm seeing people, for example, debate on Facebook about whether ivermectin is a good treatment for COVID. And I see a lot of junk information related to this, but I did see one study, and the study was done in Bangladesh with 72 people. And the conclusion of the study was that ivermectin, that's the horse dewormer you've been hearing about in the news, may reduce the duration of COVID. Now, 72 people is a really small sample. And when you consider that people react to COVID really differently, we don't really know why. Some people get a cold, and then some people end up dying. And we don't, of course, if you're older, you're more likely to get really sick and die, but we really don't know much beyond that. And then there are young people who get very sick and die. We don't know why. So this study basically, to me, was enough to say, this might be worth studying further, but I would not make any conclusions beyond that. Oh, and one other thing I'll just mention, I do not have a journalism degree, but I took a speech class in college, and they had us read a book called How to Lie with Statistics. And that was probably one of the best things I got in my college education. Other things you learn in journalism school: ethics, interviewing, writing, copy editing, and kind of the rules of the game, which is what I'm going to kind of get into now. Interviewing in and of itself is an art. Particularly if you're doing it on television, where you can't sort of ask a few stupid questions and go, oh, never mind, that's not really where I want to go. If you're on television, you have to really go in, and usually you do a lot of pre-interviewing so that your interview almost is a story in itself, with a beginning and a middle and an end. And by the time you ask that question, you on television live, you really know what the answer is going to be, more or less. So here's a question for people to answer in the chat. True or false? Editorial decisions are made with the goal of selling papers? Just take a stab. First guess on this one. True or false? Okay, let's see what we got here. Okay, true, false. Okay, that's the right answer. It's kind of a yes and no answer. And it's kind of one of those things where, again, it's a little more complicated than it looks. So if the first thing I would say is that if a story is not of interest to anyone or very few people, it's just not going to be in the paper. It could be kind of an important story, or certainly can be an important story to the people involved. But if it's not of interest to your readership, it's probably just not going to end up in the paper. Do reporters, but so here's sort of the yes and no. Do reporters intentionally trump up stories to sell papers? I would put it this way. I think reporters notice when stories generate a lot of buzz. They see how many hits they're getting. They see how many comments are showing up on social media. They see letters to the editor, and they'll follow that. People are interested in the story. We'll cover it again tomorrow. We'll go into more detail. We'll take another angle with it. We'll do a follow-up. So in that sense, yeah, reader interest, which does sell papers, does guide decisions. It's not just because it sells papers, because that's how we're serving our readership. But the key thing to understand is that papers generally don't make their money on subscriptions directly. They make their money on advertising. You can't charge a lot for advertising if you don't have good circulation, obviously. Papers, they don't make their money just on selling papers. Just understand that. One of the things that I have seen, which I find it's kind of unfortunate, but it's not exactly dangerous. Ad dollars do tend to drive editorial direction. And the prime example of that is the publication the one last section of the paper that still hires freelancers and that I write for, and that's the senior living section. Now, the reason that section exists is because there are a lot of ad dollars related to senior living communities right now. Assisted living, independent living, those types of communities, they're getting built. They always are trying to keep up their, the number of their heads in beds kind of thing. They're always trying to keep people coming in. And so they tend to buy a lot of advertising. And that is why that section exists. Now, the material in the content in that paper, however, is not advertorial. I write it as an independent journalist. And I don't really feel like, and I have said some pretty hardcore things about assisted living communities, not some pointed things, I would say. I've interviewed people who work in the field who've said some things about, some are good, some are bad, and some on that. And I have rarely felt any pressure to, paint a overly positive picture of these communities that buy all of our ads. I did say something once that my editor thought it was a little too strong, and it was probably a little bit unfair, and I kind of backed off on it when my rewrite. And that was probably related to editorial, to the fact that we do get all these advertising dollars from these communities, but factually the information is still good. So take that for what it's worth. Okay, next one. If a reporter makes a mistake, no big deal. They just print a correction. True or false? Okay, not seeing it. Oh, here's an answer. Okay, I got a few answers. Okay. False, 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 false. Correct. You are correct. It is a big deal. If the Dallas Morning News, if you make an error, even if you make an error before the story gets to print, but it's sort of further along in the line, like you've passed it on and now it's only it's in copy editing, and then you realize you made a mistake and you have to fix it, you have to not only report the mistake and obviously get it fixed or have a correction printed, you have to explain how you made the mistake. And you're not allowed to say, I just screwed up. And sometimes you have a good reason. You know, the PR person gave me incorrect information and here's the email to prove it. But it's a little bit of an humiliating process, and your editor does not want to do this. They do not like to do that because too many of those and you get flagged. So it's a big deal to make a mistake that requires a correction. And, you know, it's just as embarrassing to misspell a name as it is to get, you know, something more, you know, significant wrong. Okay, so I often come up with this question. Since I write for the senior living section. So here's the question, yes or no? The reporter asks an interviewee for her age, and the interviewee says, nope, I don't want to tell you. Should the reporter insist? Yes or no? Okay. No. Okay, you are correct. Nobody has an obligation to reveal personal information to a reporter. Really, the only time when someone has an obligation to talk to a reporter, at least a moral one, maybe not a legal one, is if you're elected representative and something is happening that needs to be explained. You really owe it to your constituents to somehow communicate to them what's going on. I can't, as a reporter, force you to do that, but I would feel more emboldened to press. But here's an interesting thing. So if somebody asks, and I ask them to their age and they say, I don't want to tell you, that's fine. But the question actually that comes up more often is the person's age even relevant? Should we put the person's age in the story? And with senior living, often I do feel the need to at least make it clear that the person we're talking to is an older person, because or has some kind of, you know, personal experience with the subject. But you don't always have to do that with age. Now, so it's easiest to just say Jane Smith, 72, you know, says that she liked this senior living section, senior living community because XYZ. But if Jane Smith doesn't want to give me her age, I might call her a retired school teacher, for example. And that gets across the idea that she's an older person, and that you know, and that kind of that gets what that checks off the box I'm trying to get. It is sometimes irrelevant. For example, I wrote a story that comes out next Tuesday about seniors kind of reconnecting socially. Oh, I see I'm running out of time. Reconnecting socially after the pandemic. Okay, I'm just going to flip through the next two and not take answers. Yes or no, a source has a fairly interesting story and is willing to cooperate for a story in the paper, but only if a certain reporter covers it. Does the editor honor that request? Okay, sorry. Heck no. This happened to me. There was a person who was hosting a group of Jordanian imams that they were coming to Dallas as part of a State Department visit. This was 20 years ago or something. He said, we'll let you come in and talk to them, but we want Mary Jacobs to do the story. Now, he didn't do it because he thought I would be, you know, sort of soft on him or promotional. He just knew that I was somebody who understood some of the sensitivities and complexities of this particular story. But my editor was like, no, he doesn't get to tell me who I'm going to send. And asking can make an editor, just asking can make an editor ornery. Okay, another one, an interviewee has her picture taken for a story, and she notices that she doesn't like one of the photos. She looks at the camera or something while the photos are taken. So she calls me and says, don't use a photo of me sitting down in front of that sign. That one makes my face look fat. So does the editor honor that request? Well, I told her I'm not going to even pass that along because I'm afraid the editor will get ornery and use the worst picture of you. No, you don't get to pick how you're represented in the paper. I would not say that the editors would intentionally choose flattering photos, but they really don't like to use, for example, you know, a soft focus photo or a photo that's been photoshopped to make you look good. I mean, they might do it if somebody, you know, is a murder victim and that's the only picture they can get of them, but they really don't like to use photos that have been sort of fixed up and, you know, edited. And one more example I'll give you. An author wants her self-published book. And I don't think I put this one on here. I did not. Okay. An author wants her self-published book reviewed by a friend who works at the Dallas Morning News. Will the editor honor that request? And the answer to that is, oh, heck no. And the reason is, number one, for the most part, newspapers today do not review self-published books. Now, there are good, well-written, well-researched, factual or fictional self-published books. There's not a book being self-published does not necessarily mean that it's bad, but the morning news or any newspaper that has a book page, when they had a book page, they get literally hundreds of books a week. So one of the first ways they call the onslaught of incoming books is they only take books that have been published by a publishing house, a reputable publishing house. And one of the reasons they do that is that it kind of, if a publishing house publishes your book, they invest money in it, then at least theoretically, they've vetted the author and they've made sure that the facts are checked. So in a sense, they're sort of doing the homework for the paper. So, and then second, the last person that would be allowed to review the book would be a friend of the author. That happens occasionally for reasons like special reasons. And even if that happens, the author has to disclose, I know this person. Usually if it's like somebody really famous or something. So those are some examples of kind of the rules of the game that you learn in journalism. And these were rules that I did not know. And I did not understand when I got into the newspaper business. I once had a story where I talked to the source, called him up, sort of preliminary conversation, and it basically involved a controversy in this person's church that related to something that was happening in the news. This is not recent. It's probably about 10 years ago. So I talked to him a little while, talked to my editor, told editor what the story was about. And then the pastor calls me back and says, I don't want to do this story. This is my congregation's been through a lot. This is upsetting. I don't want to put more in on it. Well, my editor said, sorry, we're going to do the story. You've already talked to the reporter. You didn't ask for, off the record or anything like that. No deals were cut, and we will write the story with whatever we can find from here. If you don't want to talk to me, that's your option, but we are going to do the story. And my editor's basic logic was, I don't want somebody else telling me what does and doesn't go into the paper. So that may sound a little hardcore, but that's just kind of how it works.